Hello, I am Justin Malone, and today our lecture is on the deaf world, who the community members are, their traditions, and so much more. Here's the agenda for our lecture. We're going to talk more about what deaf culture is, who exactly are the community members, if it has a language, their values, traditions, and norms, if there is any literature in the culture, and as well as issues that come up between two colliding worlds. Generally speaking, cultures need to have four things in order to be labeled a culture. They must have members, they must have a language, they must have traditions and norms, as well as institutes where the marginalized community members can join and come together. So let's talk about who the community members are for the deaf community, because it is quite a diverse group. There are deaf children of deaf adults. Then we also have deaf children of hearing adults. We have CODAs, hard of hearing individuals, latent deaf, and people who are deaf blind. I'm going to go back and explain what all of these are and give you a little better idea of what they mean. So we have two groups of deaf people, one that are come into a deaf family, and that means from birth they are given language and culture exposure right from day one. And the second group are individuals who are born to families with no other deaf people, and they are not given ASL, but rather English from the beginning. So these two groups are the two main groups. Deaf children with deaf parents, again, are given language acquisition from our access from birth. Those who have children that are deaf and themselves are not deaf, we call that hearing. They might think it's too hard to learn sign language, so they don't provide sign language as an option. They try to have their child learn English and only English, or they try to find a quote unquote cure for the deafness, which is providing auxiliary aids or even a cochlear implant. Cochlear implants usually involve some sort of invasive surgery, whereas hearing aids are just worn upon the ear. Next on the list here, we have CODAs. That's an acronym for Children of Deaf Adults. They are born to deaf people who sign with them from birth on, and they also are able to hear and have the ability to have access to both language and both modalities, both hearing a spoken language and the visual language of ASL. Traditionally, CODAs grow up in an ASL or sign language dominant home where they only use sign language, and their first exposure to spoken language is prominently when they go into school. Having that bicultural ability from both gives them fluency in both languages, English as well as American Sign Language. Hard of hearing is another label that really encompasses a large spectrum of people. From profound to severe hearing loss to a slight hearing loss. The hard of hearing community members who have like a light or slight hearing loss, who could hear a large majority of, have access to spoken language and can quote unquote speak clearly. They function as a hearing person and they don't identify in the deaf community. Those with a little bit more severe or profound hearing loss will kind of move between both community members, hearing and deaf, and they'll use sign language as well. Latent deafness is regards to a person who is born with the ability to hear, and then throughout time they get sick, or they are involved, they get a disease, or they're involved in maybe some sort of freak accident that impairs their hearing. Lastly, we have deaf blindness. And just like in all of the other categories here, there is a spectrum. Blindness in itself is also a spectrum. There are different visual acuities from being able to see far or not being able to see close, not seeing in the peripherally, maybe having tunnel vision where or a reverse where you cannot see directly in front of you but you can only see outside. Again, there could be a peripheral vision loss, or you can only see on the peripheral and not directly in front of you. It's really a huge spectrum and different ways that a person can be legally blind. What's important here is that we have a deaf community, which encompasses all of these different identities. And then within that, we have a subculture with a different kind of oppression, different language and culture that people use. And that's the deafblind community. And we'll talk more about them in the coming lectures. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the community members and their background. First here, we have a person who is balanced in both communities. They live, breathe successfully in both what we'll say the deaf world and the hearing world. The next, where I identify the most, is the deaf dominant, where you feel more comfortable, more yourself, especially if you know somebody who speaks ASL. My father, who we're going. So now we're going to talk about a couple of the identities within the deaf community. First, we have children that are born deaf and they have deaf parents. And conversely, we have children that are born deaf to hearing parents. We have POTUS, we have hard of hearing, latent deaf, and deaf blindness, as you see here, bullet pointed on the PowerPoint. And I'm going to go back and now explain more of this for you. So children that are born deaf to deaf family from birth are given access and exposure to language and culture and tradition and norms. Conversely, we have deaf children who might be the first deaf person in their family, and they are showed the marginal hearing way of life, and a priority on spoken English is usually a high value in those households. The children born to deaf family, again, their parents will give them language, they'll teach them sign language, tell them deaf stories. Whereas on the other side, hearing families and parents will maybe not learn sign language. They might think it's too hard or laborious. They might focus on speech therapies as well as different auxiliary aids, such as a cochlear implant, which is a evasive surgery, or hearing aids, which is a device worn upon the ear. And I would like to mention that cochlear implants are a controversial topic in the deaf community because of the cultural perspective of it being a cure and eradicating deaf culture. But those people who get cochlear implants are still part of the deaf community. And for myself, I kind of fall in an interesting situation where I am the fourth generation deaf person in my family. My great great grandfather was the first person who was that we know of born deaf, and he did not sign. He was what we call oral deaf, where they prominently speech read and speak for themselves. My grandfather was the same, orally deaf. My father was also orally deaf. And my brother and I were both born deaf. And our parents and grandparents wanted us to have that same experience as they did as being an orally deaf person. But at that time, early intervention services were already indoctrinated into society. And they wanted to make sure that as children, we had language acquisition. So we had hearing teachers, even in preschool, who would start signing to us. And they would tell our parents that if we didn't have exposure to sign language so young, that we would be impacted by language deprivation in many ways in our lives. So they agreed for me and my education, I would have something called simcomming, where we would sign and speak at the same time, which is very ineffective because there isn't a great priority set on either language, where speech is impacted by the signing and the signing is impacted by the speech. But I'm so grateful that I was able to have access to sign language. My experience is vastly different from my parent, where my father was, and my grandfather and my brother, were colonized by their language and tried to be as mainstream as possible, whereas my experience was a little different. Next on the list, we have CODAs, which is an acronym for Children of Deaf Adults. There are different spectrums in this coda. There are deaf children, hearing children who are born to culturally deaf individuals who learn ASL from day one. They live in an ASL dominant or sign language dominant household, and they might not be exposed to English until they go to school. The second group is one where they might have exposure to both languages and both modalities, a sign language and a spoken language, but the spoken language maybe not so much. So when they go to school, again, this is their first full exposure to language. They might have to have speech therapy or something. And the last group is a group of CODAs with an experience much like myself, where they do a lot of simcomming or signing and talking at the same time, where they have, family members who can who speak English or different languages and expose them to a spoken modality of language, and their deaf parents will expose them to a sign language, so they'll really have both and be bilingual. Next on the list is hard of hearing, and this as well comes with a spectrum to mild, severe, and profound. I myself have a profound hearing loss. My brother has a severe hearing loss, and my father had moderate most of his life, but then he worked in a factory type machinery setting, which impacted his hearing and made it a little bit quote unquote worse. So now he has a moderate hearing loss. Usually, those in hard of hearing with a slight hearing loss don't engage with the deaf community. They don't want to sign. They don't want to have anything to do with deaf culture and reject that experience altogether. For myself, I grew up, as I mentioned, speaking, trying to be oral deaf, and then simcomming. And those deaf people who didn't speak as clearly as I did, I judged them. I thought that I was superior to them because of my speaking abilities, my abilities to mesh into mainstream society. And it wasn't until I went to Gallaudet University where I really had this life-drawing experience of the diversity of deafness and the deaf identity. I was so fortunate to have exposure to the deaf community growing up. I have a cousin who is profoundly deaf, and they knew about the culture and the language, and they would share with me as much as they could as I was growing up. But really, going into Gallaudet was quite a different experience for me. I definitely struggled. I had an identity crisis growing up, understanding what deafness is. And it wasn't until then that I I was able to step into it, and that's a big experience for many people when they struggle with this kind of identity or cultural acceptance. Next, we're going to talk about latent deafness. And this is for a person who is born hearing and over time lose their hearing. And they can lose it due to many factors. Perhaps it's a generational thing where just they will unfortunately lose their hearing over time. Maybe a work experience, they work in a loud environment that impacts their hearing to the point of creating a severe loss, or some kind of accident. I had a student in the past who was born hearing, and they worked in a printing factory. And at that time, uh, it was the machine got hit by lightning, which hurt them and impacted their hearing, which is like quite a freak accident. Another story of another person who was wearing a necklace and again got struck by lightning and lost their hearing. And this is two different people that I have met that experiencing a lightning strike and as a result lost their hearing. So could latent deaf could impact people in different ways, and again in just some random freak accidents. Individuals who are latent deaf grow up not knowing about deaf community, and when they lose their hearing don't feel fully immersed in that identity or in that culture. Some of them reject it, some of them don't even know about it. If it is something generational where they know that in their 30s or 40s they might lose their hearing, they might start learning AS sign language or about the community early on to help them transition. But that's not the case for everybody. In some of these other categories, I talked about a spectrum. And lastly, here, deaf blindness also has a spectrum. There's a range of hearing as well as a range of blindness. Some visual acuities where they can't see far or they can't see close up. Some might not be able to see in their peripheral vision. Some might have a blackness in their center of vision. Some might have tunnel vision, which is a reverse where they can only see a small space in front of them and nothing around that. So again, there's a huge spectrum there. And what's important to note is that while we do have a deaf community with a variety of cultural members, there also is a subgroup, which is the deafblind group, who have their own language and their own culture and their own experiences. But what's important and what brings all of these people together is they have very similar experiences with autism. Um, Deafblind people experience autism and videism, but so they have a bit of a double oppression. And of course, there's other factors that can come into this too. Whatever their intersectionalities might be, can impact them as well. And we will talk about that more to come in later on in the lecture.
Now I'm going to give you a bit of background on different categories of community members. We talked more generally on the last slide, and now we're going to put some actual words to those people groups we were talking about earlier. So, first, here we have balanced bicultural deaf people, and this is individuals who live, quote unquote, in both the hearing and deaf worlds. My brother himself identifies as someone in this category. He's equally comfortable around hearing people and people who use American Sign Language. But he does prefer to sign. Now we have deaf dominant bicultural individuals, and I identify as this myself. I do live in both worlds, but it's important that when I am with individuals who are using American Sign Language, that's when I feel my most comfortable. And I can get by in the hearing world, but it does take a lot more energy and it is a lot more work for me to communicate in an environment where people aren't using sign language. Perhaps at the college where I work with coworkers, I have to write back and forth with people. And then when I get home, I'm just worn out and I have to recover after having those interactions where I'm not using my preferred modality. But when I'm with my deaf friends, that's when I recharge because I have instant access to language and we're both communicating in the same modality. Whereas when I'm in a world where I am trying to communicate in English or not in ASL, in that case, I have to work that much harder. Now we have hearing dominant bicultural deaf people, and those are individuals who have limited contact with the deaf community. So, for example, my father would fall into this category. He does identify as an older deaf person as someone who was more attuned to hearing culture. He learned sign language later within his life. As I mentioned, he worked in a factory, and the people around him, well, aside from one coworker, um, did not know sign language. And so he was not exposed to ASL or any sign language at all. So he has what we say limited contact within the deaf community. And those people within the deaf community that he has contact with are his family members, myself, my brother, a few others. Um, so he does not really identify so much as being within the deaf community, but more within the hearing community. Now we have culturally separate deaf people, and that's someone who interacts with the hearing community, but at a minimal, kind of the reverse of that category we just talked about. And so that's people who prefer to interact with the deaf community. And it's not that they're completely separated from the hearing world, but they feel that they're on equal footing within the deaf community. So that's their preference. And because obviously when you're communicating in your language modality that you prefer, it's less work. It's just more fluid that way. Now we have culturally marginalized individuals, and that's those who feel like they do not fit into either world. So if you remember my story about how when I went into Gallaudet University, I finally found my identity. And before that, I was having an identity crisis, and it wasn't until that moment in time when I had that culture shock that I finally developed my identity. And as I'm thinking about my brother, I wish that he would have that experience as well. And if you remember the story that I was just telling you about how I grew up simultaneous communication, simcomming, and how I experienced that culture shock in 2015 when I went into Gallaudet University, um, you know, I was trying to, I felt that had one foot in both worlds, that I was trying to straddle these two worlds. And it wasn't until I finally found my people within the deaf community in 2015 that I moved out of this category. We have culturally isolated individuals, and that's those who choose not to interact with the deaf community at all, but rather prefer to interact with the hearing community. And as I mentioned earlier, those individuals who consider themselves hard of hearing or have mild hearing loss, like my grandfather, he had no interaction with other deaf individuals or within the deaf community. He preferred to completely stay within the hearing community. Now, my brother and me and my father, it's so interesting. We all have these different identities, but we do consider ourselves deaf. Whereas my, you know, my brother is involved in both community. It's just so interesting. We all fall into these different categories within my family. But finally, we have culturally captive, and that's those who grew up without any knowledge whatsoever of deaf culture or the deaf community. They were simply isolated and living within a hearing world without any contact with the deaf community or other deaf community members. It's important now that we take a look at the difference between language and communication, as they are not the same. So there is a prevalent misconception that American Sign Language is not a language, but is rather a means of communication. Many people think it is simply gestures. And I'm here to tell you that ASL is a language. It has its own grammatical and linguistic structures and has been proven to be a language. So languages have sets of rules that allow people to communicate efficiently. Languages also evolve over time and can discuss some things that have happened in the past, present, and future. And in order to be a language, it must check all these boxes. Now, a gestural communication system does not check all those boxes and therefore is not a language. Now, communication. is when we have a transfer of information, be that verbally or non-verbally, and that communication is frozen and does not change over time. And that's the difference between a communication and a language. Here in American culture, um, we have different kinds of ASL, American Sign Language. We have mainstream ASL, we have Black ASL, and that has its own unique history. That Black ASL was developed before desegregation within residential schools where Black students were segregated. And in the 1980s, or when oralism was a prevalent philosophy.
You missed the Milan conference.
Yeah, yeah. I was behind and I missed the so Black ASL has its own unique history, and in the South there were when Black schools and white schools were segregated. There was a conference that happened in Milan, and there was a vote that took place that banned the use of not only American Sign Language, but all sign languages. And this philosophy spread throughout the world, and it impacted schools here in America, and sign language was banned, and deaf children were forced to learn how to speak. However, within Black schools, uh, children who are Black and brown were still being educated within using American Sign Language. And when desegregation happened, there was a lot of criticism of Black deaf students who were seen as using inappropriate or not grammatically correct signs. And at that time, the oppressive nature of American Sign Language was put on these Black deaf students. And at that time, when sign language was still banned, students would be punished. So white students would be punished for using American Sign Language. However, Black deaf students still had access to the language. And when the landmark decision of Brown v. Board of Education happened, and schools were desegregated, that Black ASL started to fade away, and it didn't completely uh, die out. However, there's been a lot of research that's been happening lately that has recognized we're just beginning to scratch the surface of the rich history of Black Deaf ASL and its unique nature, as opposed to just white mainstream ASL. There's different sign languages that are used. We have American Sign Language, British Sign Language. The deaf community uses their own form of sign language, tactile sign language. And so here in America, there are several different forms of sign language that we use. And sign language is not universal. LSF is the French sign language that is used within France. Japan has their own sign language. British Sign Language is distinct from American Sign Language. Australia has their own sign language, so the sign language is not universal. Each country across the globe has their own unique sign language, as spoken language is unique to each country. Now we have different contact systems, for example, Signed Exact English, SEE1, SEE2, Love, Qt Speech, and SimCom. And these are not recognized languages. These are systems that have been devised within school settings to help children learn English. And I must say that generally these are not successful and cause language deprivation in children as they grow. So it's really important. What I want you to take away from this is that American Sign Language is a language. It has rules. It checks all the boxes for being a language. And contact systems are not languages because they do not check all of these requirements for being a language.
In the previous slide, I talked about the variety of languages and sign languages used across the globe. And now we're going to talk about what is used here in American Sign Language. ASL is used in the United States of America as well as Canada. um, as well as what we see here, Mexican Sign Language, Black American Sign Language, PTASL, and then there's a gestural international sign language. But that's not a real sign. International sign language is more of uh, a, a universal communication system. It's not a language yet or a shared language. It just has gestures, and in those gestures we could effectively have communication exchanges. So many Americans, for example, will travel to, say, Italy, and Italians are famous for using their hands and gesturing often when they speak. It's part of their culture. And while somebody from America might go to Italy, they can't have a conversation or communicate, but maybe they will naturally turn to gestures to have some successful communication. One story I'd like to share with you is that usually it takes things slowly to adopt into the system, but missionary groups will go into third world countries or poor communities, and they'll find deaf communities, and they will teach them their own superior sign language, which tends to be American Sign Language. So there's been a bit of a linguistic imperialism when it comes to signed languages across the country, where they have eradicated the natural local signing and replaced it with American Sign Language. Usually, they'll view American Sign Language and people who use American Sign Language as, say, smarter, um, more able to function in mainstream society. And so they will reject their natural language and take an American Sign Language, just like imperialism and colonialism happened with the spoken English language, is now been happening with a signed American language. Next, I'd like to talk about schools. And depending on the type of school you go to, of course, dictates the type of experience that you have. Um, there are mainstream schools that might have a strong deaf and hard of hearing program, and they'll have self-contained classrooms where the students will come kind of isolated and come together. However, those that are deemed the smartest of the group will be taken out of the isolated classroom and put into the general public, the mainstream classes. Unfortunately, what happens is that those students in the isolated classrooms are what we call deaf plus. They are deaf and have uh, different or additional disabilities. Um, and that is what the deaf plus community would like to be called, deaf plus, not deaf and disabled. So those, and I am not a deaf plus individual, but that is what I've been informed by the community. So they will need a different additional supports and services, and so the stigma comes that with that in a mainstream setting. Next, we have residential schools where deaf students go and they stay in a dormitory, like a boarding school. They're called Deaf Institutes, and they are immersed day and night with language and culture and stories and just constantly surrounded by deaf people. Next, there are day programs where they might travel some distance to go to a deaf school and then travel back home to be with their family at night. So they travel, they commute um, to a day school, and that could be like an all-day event and a fully deaf school. One thing I wanted to add about that first school, your local school, which might have a deaf and hard of hearing program, they usually have teachers that are not deaf themselves. Rarely you'll find a teacher with language fluency. There's also this sign that I did here, which maybe might represent a student who's going to their local public school and they are what's called mainstream, but the only deaf person in that district. And so they are extremely isolated. They aren't exposed to language or culture or other role models and are usually by themselves. I myself experienced that first example, and there in my program we had 30 deaf and hard of hearing students. My father, unfortunately, was in that second experience where he was one of only two deaf people in his whole public school district. Next, I'd like to talk about deaf gatherings when they come together. There are so many different types. Very popular now are deaf chats. We'll have coffee chats where they come together and share language and stories. There are church gatherings. Movie theaters sporadically will have open caption days where the deaf community come together and have access to the video. There are cruises, annual cruises, deaf blind cruises. They have a deaf resort. I forget the exact name, but there's information out there. Unfortunately, deaf clubs aren't thriving as they used to. I know New York City, Virginia, they still have uh, very active deaf clubs, but unfortunately, they have really dwindled over the year with people attending and coming together. We have ASL slams too, where people come together, they share stories and different fun aspects of the language, kind of like a hearing poetry slam, but ASL slam. And they're very prominent in New York, and we do have them in ASL. Next, you'll see the Busboys and the Poet. This is really more hearing related, where hearing people will come and show the signs that they've learned to songs every now and again. A deaf person will come up and share their experience or deaf poetry. I don't usually attend them. I do love ASL slams and all the other things on this list. I miss open captions, but church gatherings, I'm not a big fan of, but I will attend many of the coffee champs. What happens though is that a lot of students will infiltrate the coffee chat. Their teachers will require ASL 1 or 2 students to show up to a local deaf chat at a Starbucks. And deaf people are trying to connect and get together, and then they have to kind of hold off on their own uh, cultural connection needs to now be the role of the teacher and slow down their signing and to make the hearing visitors feel welcome and accepted into our community and our experience. But it's really for the deaf people to connect. In my ASL classes, I do not assign that until there's a little bit more language fluency, say in ASL 3 or 4, because at that level, you should have the ability receptively as well as expressively to have casual conversations with the individuals attending these gatherings.
Now, deaf culture has different rules and norms than we might see in hearing culture. And if there's a deaf person that has their back to you, you might wonder how to get their attention, right? If they can hear, you would be able to shout their name, but that doesn't work with someone who is deaf. So there's different strategies that deaf people utilize to get each other's attention. So if you're in a place where there's a wood floor, you can stomp on the floor to get someone's attention, and they'll feel the vibrations and be able to turn towards you. Also, we use flicking the lights on and off to get attention. For example, if my students are being chatty in my classroom, instead of trying to get everyone's attention individually, I will flick the lights on and off, and then everyone will know to look at me. Another way is just simply waving your hand in front of the person that you're trying to get their attention, or just using another person saying, "Hey, would you mind tapping that person for me?" And not often, but sometimes we might throw an object at the person to try to get their attention, something soft, maybe like a cap or a pen or something just to say, hey, look over here. But this list is not exhaustive. There are many more ways that we use to get each other's attention. Technology is great. We call each other through FaceTime, and we also can help each other by saying, hey, so and so's trying to get your attention, calling the other person to calling someone near them through FaceTime to get their attention. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of different ways that we use. So deaf spaces generally tend to have open areas or glass areas where you can see someone either through the glass or catch their reflection if they're trying to get their attention behind you. Also, deaf spaces will often have a lot of mirrors so that we can see behind us and whatnot. So I want to draw your attention to this quote by Dr. Tom Humphreys. And if you remember, I was just explaining how autism is oppression based on one's ability to hear, discrimination and oppression based on a mindset and a belief system that causes discrimination against those who cannot hear. And hearing people tend to think that those who cannot hear or cannot speak are less than. That is the concept behind the philosophy of autism. Now, Vidism, as I mentioned with deafblind people or blind people in general, not necessarily deafblind people, is that those who are sighted are superior to those who have vision loss. And it's not even a question of partnering or seeing how to come alongside those who have vision loss, but it's just a simple writing off. There's another term that I cannot remember the specific term, but it is protactile, PTASL, and that is a mode of communication that utilizes touch on an individual's body that is utilized by some members of the deafblind community, but not all. There are those that don't feel comfortable using this mode of communication. But as I mentioned, protactile is one of those modes of communication, and deafblind people do experience both autism and Vidism, and so that is they're experiencing double oppression within that.
And that third touch oppression, I will give you the word for as a follow-up to this lecture.
So now let's talk about Devia. How through artwork, deaf individuals are fighting back against that oppression. So Devia, the DE in Devia stands for deaf, and the VIA is for visual image art. So this is a movement within deaf culture to use art to fight back against oppression. So let's say I, as a deaf individual, create a piece of art. Does that automatically make my piece of artwork part of the Devia movement? The answer to that is no. So what qualifies as Devia art? It has to fall into a specific theme. And there are two themes. And the first theme is resistance against oppression. And the second is pride of deaf culture and affirmation. So that first category that I mentioned is fighting back against oppressive systems and affirming deaf culture, values and identity, and just cherishing those. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of Devia artists on the following slides, just to give you an idea of the kind of artwork that falls within this movement. Before I put the picture up, though, I want to explain the meaning behind it, just so that you can have that background and decide which of those two categories this artwork falls into, and then I'll tell you the answer afterwards. So Anne Silver is this painter who made this piece of Devia art, and we see over here deaf identity and represented as crayons. And we see here on the crayons different labels such as deaf and dumb, hearing impaired, all of these different terms. Um, and now we see the transformation to deaf identity. Now we have late deafened, coda, deafblind, all these other labels that relate to deaf identity and what it looks like today. And we can see that evolution of those labels. So now I want you to take a moment and think, does this fall into the category of resistance or affirmation? I would argue that this actually falls into both categories because we see these old labels, and that represents resistance because we're resisting those old labels that have been given to us. And then the new present deaf identity represents affirmation and all the positive labels that the deaf community has chosen to assign to themselves.
The next painting I would like to show you from Susan Dubourg. And this is called The Family Dog. You can see here the family is surrounded talking, and there's a coffee table that also mimics a fence. And there's an individual laying in the center of it. And I'd like for you to take a moment to take this in and decide if you think it's resistance or affirmation. This is resistance. Obviously, this doesn't show any bit of the community pride. It really talks about the experience of isolation. I identify with this strongly when my family comes together for any of the major holidays or birthday or a vacation. Everybody is talking, only using spoken English, and I feel extremely isolated. My brother and I will sign to each other, and my father will join in, but the three of us are put off from the whole family and segregated in that way. In my entire family, there are 9 people who experience hearing loss. There's three of us who sign and use American Sign Language, and the remaining 6 are what we again call orally deaf. They speak for themselves. Me, my brother, and a cousin of ours. My brother is married to a person who is hard of hearing and speaks and signs as well. My deaf cousin is married to a deaf person and has one sibling, a sister that signs. So that means now at family gatherings, including myself, there are 6 signers. And the rest of my large family is all uses spoken English. So I definitely can identify with that image that was just shown. Next up is Betty Miller. And as we see here, Amslan prohibited, 1972. You see fingers that are basically cut and in shackles. Do we think this is resistance or affirmative? For me, I feel that this speaks of resistance. And the reason for that is those who grew up in their local public schools were not allowed to sign. If they were caught signing, they would be hit in the hands with rulers. They're forced to sit on their hands and other horrible acts. This one, Maureen Mo Cloza, is a deaf Divya artist. And this image is called The Greatest Irony. What you will see here is a deaf baby with their hands again in shackles crying, and a hearing baby that's happy and using American Sign Language or some form of sign language. So after looking at that, I think you would say that this is a resistance here. where we have hearing baby learning to signs, baby sign language. It's well accepted in society. It's considered to be such a great thing, exposing your language to communication, your baby to communication at such an early age, where they learn basic baby language. However, if you have a deaf child, you are prohibited to sign with them, to give them any type of language access other than spoken English. And sign is considered no good for the babies. There's a famous quote from Dr. Laura Ann Petito. And as you see here, it says, the human brain does not discriminate between the hands and the tongue. People discriminate, but not our biological human brain. The brain is amazing and it really wants to learn and it wants to take in language. And their research has found this to be true over and over again.
So now we're going to be discussing the hashtag deaf talent. This PowerPoint will include different slides that show that there are a lot of hearing people out there who are getting clout for taking advantage of American Sign Language. And so deaf talent is a bit of a pushback against that. And so the reason that this hashtag started was actually by the Black BIPOC deaf community, who went on stage and who was performing in ASL. And as I just want to emphasize again, this was taken over by pioneered by the Black BIPOC deaf community, those who have met a lot of resistance. And so this hashtag was generated to commemorate that. And there are a lot of times when you might see a deaf character in the movies portrayed by a hearing person. And this person then is, or even a white person is now taking the spotlight from the Black or BIPOC deaf person who deserves this. My brain knows it, my mouth can't. I'm sorry.
I wanted to talk a little bit about hashtag deaf talent. In the deaf community, often we experience hearing signers come into our space, especially on social media, and they try to profitize and culturally appropriate our language. And unfortunately, this has happened within our community with deaf talent, and why it's a very important movement. And I'd like to talk about it. It wouldn't be fair to talk about it while not including the oppressive natures and issues that happen because of this. This started as a Black deaf motion to highlight and spotlight deaf Black people and their talents and their skills, and spotlight them to mainstream society. And unfortunately, hashtag deaf talent got hijacked by white deaf people who were using the same movement to highlight their own deaf talent, falling short of the idea that this was really to spotlight the Black deaf community and not the deaf community in totality. So I will talk a little bit more about that now.
So, as we were just touching upon the hashtag deaf talent, I think now it's important to talk about allyship and the difference between being an ally, quote, and allyship. And you can say that you're an ally and talk the talk, but not walk the walk. However, allyship means not putting yourself in the forefront of um, leading the charge, but rather supporting those who belong there on their journey. And um, allyship, and as opposed to just saying that you're an ally, means that allowing those who are members of an oppressive group who have faced oppression to respectfully defer to those and use your power and privilege to support them. And this can look like getting legislation passed, and supporting those who are trying to throw off oppressive legislation, allowing deaf voices to be heard, as opposed to taking over, lobbying in front of legislature or to police departments, allowing the deaf voices to be heard, as opposed to spotlighting oneself as a hearing person and trying to lobby on behalf of deaf people. That's what true allyship looks like, being willing to be in the trenches and do the work. And however, one issue that comes up is that um, hearing people will often not listen to deaf people. So allyship can look like opening the door for deaf people to have communication, and then with hearing people, and then stepping out of the spotlight, having a growth mindset instead of taking over, um, just stepping in to support, recognizing a place where deaf people might be facing barriers and not able to get through to the hearing people that they're trying to communicate with, or the oppressive systems that they're trying to throw off, and coming to the forefront, making the introduction, paving the way for the deaf person to have the spotlight, and then stepping back and allowing the deaf people to take the floor and have their own voice. Another part of allyship can be found here in this quote. It is a practice of unlearning and relearning. It is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individual groups. Allyship is not a one time deal, where you do one thing and you're like, yay, I'm an ally. No, it is a process, a continual process that involves accountability and consistency with marginalized individual groups.
And to wrap up today's lecture, I just want to share these resources with you. If there's more you'd like to know, there are a plethora of information out there, and these are my top 3 recommendations for you. If you're going to take DFST 3105, Deaf History and Deaf Culture, the blue book, Deaf Culture, is the textbook for that course. And then we have the diversity and deaf culture, and lastly, A Journey into the Deaf World, which is another book I strongly recommend. If you have some questions or anything you'd like to talk about more, there's a Q&A section for this lecture that I encourage you to post on, and I will respond to you there. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you. Everything that I've used for the PowerPoint is here for you on the reference page if you'd like to look more into it. Thank you.